Now, for the rest of this episode, I want to talk about some of the most common criticisms I've received over the last few years. I had my team choose these by looking at the most common arguments people make on Twitter and Reddit and Instagram, as well as articles and videos. So the first one I want to deal with is one of the most common I've received. So I'll just read this. People have the perception that your background in education is preventing you from understanding race-related issues at a grassroots level. Some people say that because of your upbringing, you're not aware of what happens in poor neighborhoods. On the other side of the coin, you've been criticized for only having an undergraduate degree in philosophy. So do you think your upbringing and education level influences your understanding of these issues? So this is actually two issues rolled into one. The first one is the argument from lived experience, and the second is the argument from credentials. So first, yes, I didn't grow up in the hood, which is hardly uncommon. Most Black people don't grow up in high crime neighborhoods where everyone is below the poverty line. Still, I grew up with tons of privilege. The only proximity to poverty I had were the stories my mother would tell me about growing up in the South Bronx in the 60s and 70s. And for those who know, the South Bronx in that era was a national symbol of chaos, crime, and poverty, not so different from the way the South Side of Chicago is spoken about today. So she grew up with that and escaped it and created a much more privileged and sheltered life for me and my sisters. And I always had immense respect for her for being able to do that. So then the question becomes, what attitude should I take toward the fact of my own privilege? The criticism of me here suggests that I should discount my own thoughts and opinions about, say, the police, because I didn't grow up in the sort of neighborhood where it would make sense to fear the police. Because I don't have that lived experience, my opinions on the subject are less informed. That's one attitude you could take toward the fact of privilege. But I would argue it's the wrong attitude to take. The problem here is that lived experience does not guarantee that you get the right answers to difficult questions. Yes, sometimes your lived experience with an issue gives you practical knowledge that's very difficult to obtain in the absence of experience. There are just so many things to learn about in the world that aren't in books and aren't online. So I'd call that practical knowledge. And I fully acknowledge in many cases, it makes sense to weigh people's opinions more highly if they've had direct experience with something. But there's also a potential downside to having lived experience, one that's rarely discussed. Namely, being too close to an issue to see it clearly. Just think about how a courtroom works. When somebody is robbed or killed or raped, who has the most direct lived experience of the crime in question? Obviously, the plaintiff does. In many cases, they're the only one who has the relevant lived experience. But imagine if we therefore let the plaintiff unilaterally decide what happened and what the punishment for the crime should be. No need for a jury or a judge. After all, they don't have the lived experience. Just let the person who actually experienced the trauma decide. Now, I imagine you can all see the problem with this. Very often, the plaintiff is angry, or they're traumatized, or they succumb to the all-too-human urge to exaggerate or to take revenge.